Obviously, I'm going to be speaking in English. I can't afford to try and speak in French. It would be a complete disaster. Let me start by thanking the University of Reims and Professor Francois Mancibo for inviting me to share my thoughts actually on this issue of Sustainable Development Goals. And as I said, I mean, these are thoughts which I am reflecting here and would love to hear your views on some of the ways forward that I've attempted to put in here on the basis of participating in a few international discussions on the subject, my own observations and of course experiences from on the ground on some of the sustainability challenges that we see also in India. Let me see if I can get this right. So I'm talking on the subject of equity in the context of SDGs and why equity. I think our previous speakers this morning covered that subject extremely well, and Carlos I think at the end also spoke about it. But equality and equity are and have been integral to human development. It was reinforced by the Human Development Report in 2011, emphasizing that both of these concepts are about distributive justice. I think you also mentioned that. And that the current generations destroying the environment for future generations is as, in a sense, criminal as present-day groups suppressing the aspirations of other groups for equal opportunities to jobs, health, or education. Amartya Sen, along with Anand Sharma, basically say that safeguarding of the future prospects has to be done without giving up the efforts towards rapid human development and the speedy elimination of widespread deprivation of basic human capabilities which characterize the unequal and unjust world in which we live. So once again, I think when we talk about the need for equity, the need for justice, I don't think that it is anybody's case that we do not undertake developmental activities. I think these are extremely critical and an essential input also into being able to achieve some of the other goals that we are talking about. This is a little bit of a busy slide, but I think essentially what we are saying, and I think as was brought out by previous speakers as well, is that inequity in a society and the disparities which are reflected in the inequity adversely affect human well-being and social cohesion. And we are seeing plenty of evidence of this around the world by exacerbating violence, crime, and conflict, and by inhibiting economic growth and stability within and across countries. So per se, the whole iniquitous world that we are living in is detrimental to overall development. And not just for the people or the groups that are today living in a situation of discrimination, but I think for society as a whole. The Brundtland Commission, to which reference has been made, has also said that a world in which poverty and inequity are endemic will always be prone to ecological and other crises. So I think the references are there all through. I'm not going to spend too much time on making the case for incorporating equity considerations in Sustainable Development Goals. There's been a tremendous amount of documentation on this, but I think the challenge that we face is how are we going to do it and how are we going to ensure that this happens. In the case of the Millennium Development Goals, I think one of the basic criticisms was that it did not incorporate equity considerations willy-nilly. It is not a deliberate thing. But, and also in the measurements and evaluation of the progress of the Millennium Development Goals, the equity considerations were not explicitly taken on board. And that's one of the criticisms, as I said. Just to prove the point that we are living in a completely unequal world, and I think as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, I hope you had a chance to read it, that while inequality and inequity are not necessarily the same, they are very similar terms, and under certain circumstances can be used to support each other. In this case, we are using some of the quantitative indicators to indicate the extent of inequality and inequity in the world. The first, of course, is on the issue of consumption of goods and services. The 1.2 billion people living in extreme poverty account for 1% of the consumption of goods and services, while the richest 1 billion consume 72% of what the world produces. Gender is another critical area, and every year I think about 1 billion people are subject to sexual or physical violence because of disparate protection under the law. It has also been proven, I think, substantially in the literature that the unequal role of women in society contributes significantly to a number of related issues, including child mortality and health-related issues. 200 million young people lack access to equal opportunities to acquire skills they need to get decent jobs and livelihoods, as per UNESCO in 2012. And I think critically, the income inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient has worsened in many countries. While in the Millennium Development Goals, we spoke about halving the number of people under extreme poverty. Poverty itself, as has again been argued quite often, is a relative concept. And if I look at the situation in India over the last couple of decades, we have revised our estimates of poverty several times. There have been different commissions that have gone into establishing what should be the poverty line. And not the least of the considerations in trying to define this poverty line was the ability of government to provide welfare measures to those that would then fall under the poverty line. So to some extent, the definition of the poverty line itself is reflective of the capacity and the capabilities of the governments to be able to deal with the challenge that there is. So I think there are some serious challenges that we face when we talk about some of these goals. In the context of the MDGs, as I mentioned earlier, inequality was recognized as something that was neglected. And in fact, some critics went a step forward and said that the MDGs may have inadvertently seen some channeling of resources away from the poorest population groups because of effects of discrimination, etc. So MDGs have been criticized on a number of accounts, although there have been a number of positives associated with the MDGs as well, and I think we will move on from there. In the post-2015 development agenda that we have been considering, the high-level panel has basically focused on addressing the problem of inequality, and it talks about 5 big transformative changes, which are listed in the bullet points on this slide, that are required. And in each of these, the concept of equity is built in quite strongly. The first major transformative shift that they're talking about is that on the development agenda, leave no one behind, put sustainable development at the core, transform economies for jobs and inclusive growth, I think comes up again and again, build peace and effective, open and accountable institutions for all, and of course, it calls for the forging of new global partnerships. Partnerships was also the basis of how we went about achieving the Millennium Development Goals, but I think there is a reinforced emphasis on partnerships. So with that background, when I move to looking at the sustainability challenges that we have to be able to address when we are attempting to define these sustainable development goals, there are many that we come across, and therefore it's no surprise that in the last meeting of the Open Working Group, there were 130 plus goals that different countries came up with from an aspirational point of view. So I think when we talk about sustainable challenges, there are those that threaten our existence as a species. Today, we are looking at climate change, and I think we had an excellent presentation, as always, from Professor Carlo Rubio on the subject, and he's challenged a lot of thinking on it, on some of the solutions. food security is becoming an increasing challenge. And of course, at the base of it, and very, very critical, is the whole area of water security. Then there are those challenges that are affecting our existence as individuals or as groups. And these are reflective, and this is not by any measure an exhaustive list, but it's just some thoughts to get us thinking in particular directions. There is the whole issue of poverty, and then we have very large numbers of people in the world that are affected by this particular problem. So, that's one key issue that is always on the top. There's the issue of nutrition, there is health, there is energy, which is often referred to as the missing or the underlying MDG. And of course, the whole issue of rights of people, which is again brought up and is reflective in the discussion on institutions as well. There are those that affect our quality of life. This relates to the issue of nutrition, of water quality, air quality, and several of the resources that we are talking about, and of course the forms of energy that we have access to. Some of these challenges that we are talking about reveal themselves as pressures, and others are the consequences or the impacts and implications of these pressures. The pressures are in the form of largely resources, water, energy, land, but they also arise from our consumption patterns, from the pattern of our growth, and from the inequitous and unsustainable governance frameworks that we have put in place and have followed. The impacts and implications of these kinds of pressures that we see are in the form of climate change, poverty, social injustice, hunger, malnutrition, and of course the inadequate provisioning of opportunities to people. So there is, as I said, a plethora of sustainability challenges. The Sustainable Development Goals that we are now going ahead and trying to define must address these challenges that are affecting our economic well-being, our environment, and society, the three pillars of sustainable development. But at the same time, the United Nations system has called upon the global community basically to say that we must keep these sustainable development goals limited in number and relatively simple. So on the one hand, we have an extremely complex, extremely interrelated set of sustainability challenges, and on the other hand, we have to be able to bring them down to a handful, or a dozen or so, or there's no number out there, but a few sustainable development goals that will encapsulate everything that we are talking about. So the question that comes to mind is, what are the underlying primary factors that are leading to unsustainability of the various challenges that we spoke about, and how do we really address them? In my rather simplistic way of thinking, I've put forward some thoughts for your consideration and discussion, which on each slide, I think then I have only 3 or 4 slides, I've listed as the first bullet point what is the underlying factor, and the second bullet point is what could be the possible solution. It is the underlying factor for the sustainability challenges that we looked at earlier is, as brought out by Carlos as well, is the unequal distribution, both historic and current, because these sustainability challenges are not something that have just come upon us. These are things that have evolved over decades and centuries. So the historic evolution is an important part. So it's the unequal distribution of monetized resources over a period of time, which has led to the inequalities that we are seeing today. And this is, of course, exacerbated by the fact that the fruit of this development that we have undertaken is not available to all in equal measure either. So these are the set of interrelated challenges, two sides of the coin that have led to inequalities. And a simplistic solution for that could be, and again it is not exhaustive, but it is again to just think about the problem, that we must have effective tax regimes for both national and international flows of commodities and services, especially deriving from resources, so as to enable governments to provide universal access to a number of essential services. If you look at the discussions and the summary that the co-chairs provided of the Open Working Group third meeting, I think the fourth is just concluding, a lot of the discussion is around the universal access to a number of services, whether it is education, whether it is health, whether it is environmental services, or whether it is energy, etc. But governments, and especially the developing country governments, are constrained in doing so. They do not have enough financial resources to be able to ensure that this happens. And I think we have to look at mechanisms by which this has to be done, and therefore the ability to be able to tax the rich, to be able to provide for the poor. Very, very simple thought, long-standing, is something that I think needs to be strengthened to be able to respond to this challenge. It is the unequal treatment of women and other minority communities that has stymied their growth potential, and therefore have led to the inequities that we are talking about and exacerbated the problem of sustainable development. We need to be able to look at legal and rights frameworks and then strengthen them to provide full protection and also to incentivize the inclusion of the currently disadvantaged groups in overall development processes. Right now, there is a high degree of exclusion that takes place. So that's another thought. The third is that historically, once again, we have neglected undertaking systematic evaluations of the consequences, intended and unintended, of our development pathways, especially on environment and society. We have considered of the three pillars, the economic pillar possibly the most closely, but environmental and social pillars have been neglected. Each policy and program of governments must be subjected to an evaluation on its consequences on all three pillars of sustainable development. And we will go back to how we can possibly translate some of these into goals, but just give me a minute. And then the last thing that I put down over here, again, this is not exhaustive. We assume that a number of Earth's resources are renewable in nature, and I think we have been proven wrong on several of these. And as a result, our pricing and consumption of the goods and services deriving from these resources has been exploitative, to say the least. We need to be able to estimate the full costs of all such goods and services, explicitly accounting for intergenerational impacts and sustainability, and make transparent any subsidies based on this approach. I mean, these are, just looking at what I thought were some of the key sustainability challenges that was facing society, and what are the underlying causes, and what could be the way forward. But I think the last 3 or 4 slides really spoke, as I said, about the underlying causes and some of the means by which we can try and address these sustainability challenges. The key question still remains, how do we translate this into goals, and goals that are going to be uniformly acceptable to all countries in the world? Because again, one of the aspirations of the UN in trying to define the Sustainable Development Goals has been that these goals, as opposed to the Millennium Development Goals, must be universally applicable and not just focused on the developing countries. That's not a mean challenge. I mean, that's a huge challenge that we are talking about. For purposes of discussion, once again, currently we are talking about universal access to health, universal access to energy, universal access to food, etc. Can we bundle these into a universal access to all developmental services as a goal that we can agree towards? The subcomponents can definitely be there. Second becomes much, much more controversial, and I struggled with this quite a bit. But we obviously cannot have a global legal framework that would imply a giving up or a loosening of sovereignty by a number of countries, and that is likely to be opposed tremendously in the political arena. But can we talk about coming up with a global and a common rights framework, which could be in the form of a model document, progress against which can be monitored and reported on. In coming up with this rights framework and having been part of the discussions in Rio Plus 20 as part of the Indian government's team that was there, privy to the official discussions that were taking place, I know that a number of these issues around rights would face a lot of resistance. But I think it would be interesting to think about whether some of these goals, rather than being just quantitative and outcome-oriented, the Millennium Development Goals were not outcome-oriented, I believe. Can we think of some of these as a process goal? Again, a question to be considered. I've also put down over here something that might sound rather simplistic, but could go a long way in bringing about and internalizing the kinds of change in thinking that I think that is required. Can we come up with annual sustainable development reports from every country? And in the sub-bullets, I've recognized that in India we have an economic survey that reports, that's a report from the Prime Minister to the Parliament on what is it that we have achieved in the last 1 year in terms of the performance of the Indian economy. We have recently started introducing some very, very nascent kinds of information on environmental and social performance as well, but it is nowhere close to what is covered on the economic dimension. But I think the involvement of governments bottom-up in preparing this report at a country level could go a long way in creating the kinds of sensitivities and in creating the kinds of competitive pressures that are required to internalize sustainable development. I was discussing with Peter Haas earlier in the morning as we were coming here, whether the US, just to take a country as an example, had something similar. I thought the State of the Union address, I wrongly thought that the State of the Union address that the President of the United States normally makes to Congress captures as much what happened in the last year as what it is that they would like to be doing going forward. But maybe not. But there are obviously, in the case of the developed countries, many, many other reports that are put out and many other actors that are involved in various reporting. But I still feel that governments need to take full ownership of these kinds of reports and what is it that they're doing in terms of their policies and programs. In a globalized world, I think such a report must also explicitly recognize implications for third countries, not third world countries, but third countries and groups. So basically, the international and global ramifications of the policies, programs, regulations, et cetera, that they might put in place and make this visible to the world as a whole. And they must specifically address the intergenerational impacts as well in such a report. So when we talk about sustainability, and as was rightly pointed out by Carlos earlier, we cannot neglect, and the Human Development Report also, Amartya Sen also spoke about it, we cannot neglect the intergenerational aspects. So can we consider in the proposals that are being considered for Sustainable Development Goals, a report of this kind that might help change the whole ethos on how sustainable development is looked at? And corresponding to some of the thoughts that I had shared earlier, can we look at a goal that would measure countries in how they are performing in moving towards transparent, well-directed subsidies? What we have been calling for, we have been hearing, is that we should remove subsidies altogether. I do not think that this is going to be feasible for several countries, given the context that they are in. It links back to the common but differentiated responsibilities kinds of arguments that, that are put forward and principles that have been adopted in this area. But it's a very different, possibly, set of goal proposals that are being put forward over here. And I would venture to say that these could possibly be considered as the overarching goals that would really define the framework in which we operate. It is not meant to ignore or to say that we don't need sector-specific goals as are being presented today. And just to give a quick example, I know I'm out of time. The example is from the energy sector. For the last 4 or 5 years, we have been involved in and this is an example of the sectoral kinds of goals. We have been involved in an exercise with under the UN Secretary General's initiative on energy and climate change. That's how we started, and then we moved to sustainable energy for all. And now we are considering proposing, and we have proposed that the goal around the energy sector should be the sustainable energy for all goal, which has 3 subcomponents to it. One is energy access to all by the year 2030. The second is that we should double the rate of energy efficiency improvements in the world in the next 20 years as against what we have achieved in the last 40 years, and that we should double the share of renewable energy in the total energy mix, again, over the same time period going up to 2030. And the technical background work that we did in coming up with these 3 goals ensured that when you take the 3 goals together, from a mitigation perspective, we would have a fair chance of staying within the 2 degrees Celsius guardrail, while at the same time addressing the vulnerabilities and the role that energy plays in building up adaptive capacities as well. It also addresses all the 3 dimensions, but I'll come back to that. It has energy as an underlying goal has been recognized as missing in the MDGs. It has strong linkages with every other MDG, and if we are to be able to achieve, let's say, the health MDG or the education MDG, energy has to form part of it. It's primarily responsible for the rapid human development that Amartya Sen spoke about and that I quoted earlier, and is also responsible on the flip side for some of the major environmental inequity challenges that the world faces. The 3 sub-goals I've already spoken about. It's a great example, this particular formulation of the goal of universality, because every country would need to get involved to lesser or greater degree in each of the goals. It talks about equity in the energy access goal that is reflected there. It talks about environment and climate protection, especially around the efficiency goals that we are talking about, but also renewables. And it definitely addresses itself to the whole issue of competitiveness, which goes to the economic pillar of sustainable development, especially when we talk about efficiency improvements in this. But the devil, obviously, as in every case, lies in the detail. How do we define? I'm taking energy access as an example. How do we define energy access? Should it be access to delivery infrastructure? And this is where I think that if you look at parallels on MDGs in some of the goals, we have failed. Should it be entitlement to a certain number of energy units, 30 units per month per family, 6 cylinders per year per household, etc., of LPG? Or should it be access to the services that are provided by energy, which is an experiment that we are undertaking in Terry, where we are saying that we will provide lighting services to those that do not have electricity in their homes and allow people to rent solar lanterns, as an example, once again. So they have basically the embodied energy that they are renting out, and the service that they are getting is that of lighting. And they're able to access the service of lighting as per their ability to pay and as per their need, and not necessarily available all the time for use or misuse, as the case may be. But the question is, of these different ways of providing energy access, what is more measurable? How do we ensure that once we have provided a certain amount of resources, especially financial resources, for providing the services, we look at the effectiveness of use of these resources? Because finally, we are accountable to either the Parliament or the Congress, etc. Where is this level of accountability higher? Possibly in the first 2 sub-bullet points that we have over there. But where is the outcome better and faster And I would tend to argue that it is possibly in the third bullet point over there. So how do we reconcile measurability, accountability with outcomes? And I'm just, again, using this as an example to raise the kinds of questions that do come up when we are talking about sustainable development goals. So I'm going to stop here in the interest of time, and I had actually a number of other slides that I deleted from here. All of them are in the form of questions. I really have no answers to be able to give you, but I would look forward to some of the discussions around this if we have time for a discussion. So thank you very much.